Good morning, WASBO colleagues. Thanks for joining us this morning for Money Talks. It is Friday, April 26th. Gosh, only maybe what, 6 weeks left of the school year? Sure goes fast. I'm Mike Berry, Executive Director for WASBO, and delighted to have you. We have two special guests joining us today, a double special guest episode of Money Talks. First, Ann Chapman, who is the WASBO Research Director and generally the smartest kid in the classroom. Good morning, Ann.
Morning, everybody.
And Brian Brewer, who is the Director of Baird Public Finance in Milwaukee. Hi, Brian.
Good morning.
Thanks for doing this. So our topic today is the spring referenda, school referenda, and more generally, just school referendum picture beyond just the spring results. But that will be our jumping off point. Will be an analysis by Brian of the referendum results that we saw most recently. So. If we can all teleport ourselves back to our high school English class here, we will recall that the word referendum, the root word of referendum is refer, right? Refer. And there's a little clue about what this is all about, just based in the name, right? Because under our complicated, some might say really clunky school finance system, decisions about securing even really routine operating revenues must be referred to the voters in a referendum, right? So the voters are asked to approve an exception to the revenue limit. I find it a bit frustrating that our lawmakers can't figure out a better way to do this, but this is what the deal that we have. So we have a lot of operating referenda each year. It seems like a growing number, at least certainly growing in dollars. I'm not sure about the growing in frequency. We'll talk about that a little bit. But the volume of the operating referenda have led to us considering, we have this thing called the WASBO K-12 School Finance Glossary. It's an actual document at WASBO. We're thinking of adding to the glossary, instead of referendum, we're going to add it. We're going to call it what it really is, which is neverendum. The neverendum is when you have to keep doing referendums again and again and again. So some of you are caught in the neverendum cycle, and it's a lot of work and it's a big distraction, but it's got to be done. So I actually have two additional suggestions on important matters of public policy in the state. The first would be if we ever have a statewide vote on legalizing marijuana, it should be called a referendum. I think this would be this would really capture the imagination of the public. I don't know, maybe not. The other would be the dairy industry. I think if we do anything with the dairy industry, it should be called a heiferendum. These are important matters of public policy, and we are delighted to talk about them here on Money Talks with you. It's Friday morning, everybody. Enough of all that. So Brian is going to get us started with an analysis. I think he's got about a dozen PowerPoint slides on the recent referendums. A couple Money Talks rules. We are recording today, so if you want to come back to this, you'll be able to get the actual recording off the WASBO website. The slides that Brian is going to use here in a minute will be available also. Just go to wasbo.com/moneytalks, and you should be able to get to it. And then feel free, as always, to use the chat to make your contribution to the discussion and or the Q&A. If we can get to your questions during the limited time that we have, we will certainly try to do that. And then lastly, I got to put in a plug for the WASBO Spring Conference. We have really, really strong numbers. Folks getting excited for that conference. It's kind of the end of the year celebration, sort of. That is at the Kalahari, May 15, 16, and 17. So if you haven't taken a few minutes to sign up for that, please do so. So with all that, allow me to turn it over to Brian Brewer from Baird Public Finance. Hey, Brian, it's all yours.
Good morning, Mike. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. As Mike mentioned, this is a collection of slides, both focused on referendums in general, the spring cycle in 24, as well as some historical information that might be useful in your planning. These slides can be used. Feel free to grab and drop into something you're doing locally. It's all DPI data. It's just each year we spend the time to aggregate it and put it into pretty pictures to help tell a story. And as we all know, unfortunately, as Mike indicated, this is a ongoing and never-ending part of the school funding process in Wisconsin. So being educated on the history of referendums and why they are what they are, and what the needs are, helps you to communicate that locally, which in the end, that communication and allowing the voters to understand why you're asking and why what you're asking for is the right solution is the key to success. So we'll go ahead and walk through some of this. I have Jordan listed here because he helped me pull together some of the materials. But he's at the WASDA convention this morning, finishing up a presentation. And I really should have the rest of the team listed here because we each collaborate to put some of this material together for clients across the state. So setting the stage, again, currently I don't see a change in proposed legislation, despite the efforts of many blue ribbon commissions and idea generators, that referendums are going to continue to be a process for raising the revenue needed to either pay for a project specific or increasingly ongoing operational budget. So we'll talk about the outcomes of the spring referendum as the needs continue and actually at a growing clip, as Ann may talk about, in the decoupling of revenue raising per pupil amount, which used to be tied to CPI. Ever since it was decoupled with Act 10, schools have fallen behind. The revenue raising ability has fallen behind. At the same time, enrollments have flattened and or declined statewide. So the combination of those two things in the revenue limit authority requires the need to backfill revenue using an exemption, which comes in the form of an increase to the revenue limit formula. So this may be very basic for experienced business officials, but not knowing the broader audience, I figured I'd start here. Effectively, there are three different types of questions that you'll see on the ballot, and then we'll talk about today. Capital is probably the most tangible question. It's the one where you're going to go into the voters to seek the ability to borrow and pay for a certain set of projects. That can be new construction, it can be maintenance projects, deferred maintenance, it can be remodeling of existing footprint, it can be land purchase. So larger ticket items that don't fit easily within your annual pay-as-you-go operational budget. Then there's the operational type questions that, again, fit into the revenue limit authority formula as an exemption to the limit. So it's a one-time increase for a certain number of years. So we call those non-recurring, or it's a increase that once it's added to the base, it then becomes part of future revenue limit authority. So we call those recurring because they continue to happen after you gain authority. So this funding is more focused on annual salaries and benefits, curriculum and instruction, which, you know, those two categories are pretty much the largest part of your expenditure budget in the school district. It can also fund some ongoing maintenance costs or some one-time infusion into the classroom. So looking back to February's election date, February 20th, there were 10 questions, of which 5 were to issue debt. They were for capital projects. 2 of those 5 received approval. There were 2 non-recurring operational questions, and only 1 of those received approval. And then recurring, there were 3, and only 1 received approval. So out of the 10, only 4 questions received approval. And that was spread over 3 districts. So pass-fail rate there was 40%, which is on the lower end of the historical norm. This map just shows where those questions were asked. And, you know, as you'll see as a theme, I have a few of these maps in here. There's no real geographic, you know, concentration of where these questions are where the need is across the state, which should be informative to the legislature that, you know, policy needs to change and more levers to pull locally for raising the necessary funding to pay for school expenditures is, you know, needs to be addressed. So here's April 2nd. So this is the more recent election date this spring. As you can see, there are 93 questions that were asked in April. Of that 93, there were 30 that were seeking the authority to issue debt. 19 of those 30 received approval. So for the spring, that takes you to 21 out of 35 questions received authority. There were 43 non-recurring operational questions, 27 of which received a voter approval for 193 million. And then there were 20 recurring questions where 11 received authority. And you'll see the subtotal of amount there, the 290 million, which, you know, relative to the 43, or well, the 27 that got approved for non-recurring seems high, but that recurring number, one of the 11 includes Milwaukee Public Schools, which their authority, as it steps into the recurring, it was about 254 million. So it's the lion's share of that 290 million that was authorized April 2nd. So just under $1 billion of funding in those 3 categories for April. And, you know, from a number of questions approved, it was 61%, which, you know, I've read some articles that talk about that being a lower pass-fail rate. And it might be a symptom of voter fatigue and the rising dollar amounts in the questions. You know, I've been working with school districts on referendums since 1997. And, you know, over that time period, you know, and I'll show you some data for the last 25 years, 61% is about the average. I mean, that's, you know, it's almost like a reversion to the mean over a long period of time. There, in the last 5 years, we have seen some years where there were 70 and 80% pass-fail rates, but, you know, I think the long-term average has been around 59-ish% pass-fail rate. So 61% is not that surprising to me. And as we talk about these statewide themes and data, just know that it really still comes down to referendums are local, right? You know, you could have the best plan, but if you don't communicate it well to where your voters hear and understand the need, they're not going to vote for So, and we have a significant number of clients that are doing the work, the homework to manage the budget year in, year out, looking ahead, positioning the need for a referendum at a time when they can layer it in to offset the impact. So you have like a no increase type of a referendum. Those still can fail, right? Because it's not just that. It's that minimizing the tax increase and crystallizing the need and then the solution in a way that the voter can say, yeah, I can get behind that. So as you look at these percentages, know that that's part of the process as well. So here again is the April 2nd statewide map. And as I mentioned on the previous map, there's no concentration. The questions were all over the state of Wisconsin, and the pass fail is also all over the state. It's not one, only Dane County schools got approval, right? That's not how it may feel like that from time to time, and then by number of of questions, but this is what it looks like on a distribution for April 2nd. So that was a spring focus. This is broadening the lens a little bit to give you some perspective on historical referendums in Wisconsin. And so this chart, while it's very busy, there's a lot of data packed into this visual. It goes back to 1990. And as we know, 92, 93 was the year that it was frozen for the beginning of revenue limits in 93, 94. So prior to that, there was very little need or use of a referendum. After that period, there was an increase in referenda. But the dark blue is the amount asked by districts in each year. The light blue is what was approved. And so to make it easier to follow and read, the red line is the percentage of the amount asked for that was approved. So in 2005, it was 34% of the amount asked for got approval. Whereas in 2020, 90% of what was asked for got approval. So as you look at this over a long period of time, and Mike could probably do this walk through history as well, but this higher amount in the late 90s and first few years of the 2000s would have been like, if I broke these bars into referendum type, these would be more heavily focused on capital. And what was happening there is state aid also was increased as part of a three-legged stool, where it was 2/3 funding commitment. So what was happening is school districts were using this opportunity to go, upgrade facilities that had not been upgraded for a decade or two. And so that's what many of these questions were focused on. And so under state law, you can finance those projects for over 20 years. So if you think about approval in late 90s, early 2000, this time period in the middle, districts were paying off that 20-year loan. And so they were biding time. At the same time, we got into and funding was still sufficient because it was the revenue limit authority was tied to CPI. So there were fewer needs for operational during that time. Mike, would you add anything to that spot?
Yeah, I think the other trend that affected these referenda from the early 90s through maybe the early 2000s is that statewide enrollment was still going up. And, under revenue limits, increasing enrollment makes it a little easier to deal with. But now you've got this combination of declining enrollment and, and not having CPI-based increases. I think Ann's going to talk about that a little bit later, but yeah, the conditions have definitely gotten tougher in terms of your annual operating budget, which then leads to, more referenda.
Absolutely. So the other thing that happens in this middle decade is, we had two black swan events in the US, right? So we
Right.
had 9/11 in here, which is when, so 2001, and then so 2 and 3 we had lower numbers. This is kind of the housing bubble, and then in 2008 we had our Great Recession, the beginning of the Great Recession, and then
Right.
you see this time period in here. That's when Act 10 was implemented. We had the toolbox school districts were using, what they were given within the expenditure side of the budget, but that decoupling from revenue in here gave rise to a couple of things. We were finishing the amortization of the 20 years from the late 90s referendum, and as Anna will speak to, the funding wasn't keeping up with expenditures. So you saw a rise in both capital questions and operational questions, to the point where the more recent, especially the even year cycles, you'll notice that this is 16, 18, 20, 22. Those have been our recent high points in number of questions asked. And, we've already had 103 questions in 2024. And I believe, based on what we've been working on and hearing from school districts across the state, November is going to be a pretty large number as well. So we will likely rival, among the highest number of questions asked in a year in 2024. So anyway, I like this chart because it's a walk through time. It's almost like a recap of how revenue limit authority has functioned for school districts. And it's a recap of Mike and my career.
Right. I think one of the accelerators recently has been inflation too. It's really difficult to sit across the table from the teachers union and they're asking for 8% or even 4% now, and say, yeah, sure, we can do that under the existing revenue limits. The math just doesn't work.
Right. So that data in a different format is what this slide is. So this one goes back to 2000, and this gives you statistical numbers of the questions that were asked under each heading. Authority to issue debt, non-recurring operational exemption, and recurring operational exemption. This is where you can see that the even years are the ones where there's a larger number of questions asked. And I have, some information later that aggregates the same data, but by election time period. So, February versus April versus August versus November, that would inform some of this as well. So I'll cover that here in a minute. But this, again, for those of you that like data, this is a summary of what the DPI has out there and available on the historical information.
If I have to choose between a graph and a table, I'll take a table anytime.
Yeah, and this also helps you more clearly see those 80s and 90% in here in the previous 5 years. So again, that only through that lens does it make the 61% approval rate seem low.
Right.
I remember back in the early 2000s, we would love to have a 60% approval rate at that point, because it was not that favorable. So these next 3 slides break that data and kind of zoom into just the last 10 years, because that's kind of our modern school funding formula, right? So we're now 10 years, if you think about it, we're post Act 10 and the few years after that, right? That started in fiscal year 11. And so this is from 14 to 24. And it's the number of questions asked is the upper right corner, that pie chart. And then the map is showing the on the left, the blue shaded districts. There are 196 districts that received approval for a non-recurring referendum in the last 10 years. There were 90 districts that did not receive approval. Now, if you look close enough at the map, you'll see that there are certain districts that are colored on both maps because they've asked multiple questions. You know, maybe one failed and he came back, asked something different, and that got approval. So I think a key note from this is that even though the combined total here is 286 districts, there were 242 unique districts that asked a non-recurring operational. So 57% of the state school districts in the last 10 years alone have asked for a non-recurring.
Wow.
So
Brian, to me, that shows back to your comment about the legislators and looking at trend. I mean, I don't know what more they would need to see that this many districts are going for operational referendum in the last 10 years. And we're not talking about 10% of the districts, and it is scattered all over the state.
Yeah, and that's just non-recurring.
And that's just a non-recurring number. And a slide I don't have in here that we often show to crystallize your point, Brian. There are currently 100 districts that have more than 10% of their revenue budget tied up in a non-recurring. Like it's authorized by a non-recurring. So roughly a quarter of the school districts, are reliant on a renewal of a non-recurring for 10% or more of their revenue budget, which is,
Yeah,
not
I think that's
sustainable.
what those numbers, I think, are the basis for what really frustrates, I think, a lot of board members, superintendents, and business officials, which is that, this is a funding issue that has to be referred to the voters, which seems, like an extraordinary thing, right? And you're asking for an exception to the revenue limit. Like it's an exceptional thing that has to be referred to the voters. And really what it's all about is just routine operating money. We've taken what should have just been ordinary and expected and made it extraordinary and requiring special approval. And we're talking about just trying to get the schools funded at CPI. I think that is the biggest divide politically between the people who see this as a problem and the people who don't. I'm getting preachy. I'm going to save that for Ann later.
So we'll keep moving through here because there's a lot we can spend and talk about on each of these slides. But this visual is the recurring operational referendum for the last 10 years. So you see the number of questions asked and the pass-fail rate. 95 districts have received approval, again, dispersed around the state. Here, you could make a little bit of an argument that Dane County has a little bit higher passage rate than other places in the state, but 44 districts asked and failed. But in aggregate, this is 130 unique districts for recurring. I do want to make a point that it's not necessarily unique between this and the previous slide. So there are likely districts that have asked both types in the last 10 years. So the final visual, 10-year recap and distribution of questions across the state. The pie chart shows the number of debt referendums or capital referendums to pay for a project, to borrow funds, to pay for investment in facilities. So 296 districts have received approval in all corners of the state, and then 107 asked and failed. So the total number of unique districts is 331, or just shy of 79% of districts have asked for a debt referendum in the last 10 years to pay for upgrades and improvements to the school facilities. So now what, right? That's historical data. You're in the middle of trying to figure out the funding for your district. If you went to a spring referendum and failed, you're likely in a debrief process and trying to understand, what did the exit polls tell you? What's the feedback you're receiving from your community on why they voted the way they voted. Ultimately, you're evaluating. You went to referendum for a reason, and it's not a fun process. I like to say that when we're in town hall meetings and people are upset that the district's asking, it's like, this isn't fun for the administrative team to run a referendum. It's in addition to the day job. It is not. It is not
Right.
an easy process.
I don't know anyone who's getting paid on commission, that's for sure.
Right. And so you ultimately are mapping out, like you've been doing, looking at your budget and figuring out what are your choices. I mean, likely if you already went in the spring, it's because you needed to. And then if it's a project-based plan, like for an issuing debt, evaluating that planning and figuring out, how can I alter it and bring something back that the voter will see as the right long-term solution.
Right.
So, potentially that may come in the form of a survey, a post-mortem type survey, debrief, like, what can we adjust? What was why did you vote the way you voted? Communication, evaluate your communication process. What could we have said things differently to make it more clear, right? To understand what the need is and why the solution is the solution the board put forward. As you evaluate those future election options, be aware that there is a statute on the books that limits the number of questions that a district can ask in a calendar year. So it's 2 is the most you can ask. But with that said, of the 28 districts that failed an operating question in the spring, 27 of them only asked 1 question. So in theory, they could put a new operating question back on the ballot in the fall. While it's not the best for your budget building process, you in theory, a fall election authority can still turn on revenue limit authority starting in 24-25. So just be aware of that there's still time for that. It's better if you get it in the spring so that what your salaries and what you're working towards in the fall, but it's not impossible.
Right. I've seen a number of those where the school district has said going into the new year, where it's like kind of an either or budget. Like, we're going to have a referendum for operating purposes in November, and if it passes, we'll do A, and if it doesn't pass, we'll do B.
Right. And then, and that's kind of leading into this right side. It's, communicating the alternatives, right? This is the reason we're asking, and this is what'll happen if we're not able to fund this part of the budget.
Right.
So this page shows the future dates. So here are the fall dates. Most importantly, here are the adopt and file dates. So the 70 days prior to the election. So if you're looking at a November 5th, that means that your board has to have acted and you have to have filed your paperwork with the clerks by August 27th. And then if you're not ready or don't want to go in the fall, your next cycle is in the spring of 25, and there is no fall of 25, right? In odd years, there's no fall election cycle. So you'd be going to the spring of 26 as your next earliest date.
I think that those dates actually line up reasonably well for school districts, especially like the November of 24 referendum cycle. Board has to pass a resolution by, was it August 27th of 24? Typically the community's not easy to engage in June, July, and August anyway. So you pass the resolution right as you're coming into the new school year, kind of people are starting to think about school again. And you can use that run from late August to November to promote your referendum. It's not a bad calendar scenario.
Yeah. it's just the only reason I like to highlight it now is that means that the leadership team and the board has work to do to be ready to act in August. So some
Yes.
summertime work to, you know.
There might be some administrative vacations that are interfered with, but small price to pay.
So this is the aggregated data that I was referencing earlier by election date. So
Yeah.
February has, February and August are the fewest number of questions asked, and you'll see that February has hovered around that 60% for the non-recurring in debt, and then August is also kind of mid 50s. Recurring in general is tougher because it's a more of a permanent sell on increase to the revenue limit, and sometimes voters have a hard time saying, I don't know why you think you need it forever, right? So it's that permanent aspect of it that makes it a harder. So the ones that pass are often attached to a new facility, because you can then make a statement like, for this additional square footage, we can budget that we need this amount extra for the life of the facility.
Right.
But really the takeaway is the April and then the November. So by number, April is the largest time period, primarily because there are 2 April in every biennium cycle, an even year and an odd year. So, and the pass fail is in that 58% and 66% and then 45%. This year, I think voter turnout had something to do with April results, because of where it landed with, we had a late spring storm that didn't help certain districts in certain parts of the state.
Right.
The fact that the presidential primary was already decided, it was uncontested really. So that didn't motivate people to get out and vote. So there are reasons why, each April can be better or worse.
Yeah.
Really the takeaway is November.
Even spring break occasionally.
That's right. That's right. Spring break for certain districts kind of fell on or around this year's vote date. But the November cycle, we break it out for the presidential and non-presidential, but either one is over 70%. And, some of that's because it's fewer questions, but I believe most of it is because it's motivating your school age parents to get to the polls, because they will likely go vote for governor. They will likely go vote for the president. And you don't have to motivate and get out the vote locally for a school referendum, right? So it doesn't mean you should always target November, but there used to be a line of thinking that the fewer the voters, the more likely a school issue would pass. And really this special election, which is oranged out because state law has outlawed a special election, but the pass fail rates historically would indicate you shouldn't have done a special election anyway, because it's harder to get your base out to the poll, and there's 70% of your voting base that doesn't have a direct tie to the school, so they will vote no matter when you host it. So this is information. It's helpful in your planning process. With a presidential coming up in November, I expect there will be a larger turnout. So in the end, you go when you're ready to go. You go when you have the need, and you can communicate that need. But if it ties into a November, it's more likely that your school age parents will be at the poll.
Yeah, I recall on the old special election dates that those were fairly or unfairly, it often created the perception that the school district was trying to sneak one by, and that kind of put the school district on a defensive right away, and kind of motivating for the sort of the opposition. So those were never such a great deal to begin with.
Right, I agree.
Yeah, and the idea that a low turnout is somehow favorable, that's just, it doesn't, the numbers just don't support that. Oh, hey, that was a great deck, Brian. All that will be on the WASBO um, website under Money Talks, probably within an hour of us wrapping up here this morning. So I want to thank you for that statistical overview and invite you to stick around for a few more minutes if you could or would.
I will, absolutely. Thanks.
I wanted to turn it over to Ann for a few minutes. Because Anne, you've been presenting around the state for more than a year on various topics, but one of the ones that I've always enjoyed listening to is the presentation where you sort of unpack kind of how we got here, right? Yeah, how we ended up with this system that requires this volume of referenda. I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through kind of the why behind all this, like the how did we get here situation.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the spoiler is there's something off here. I mean, to look at the maps, to look at how widespread and without a pattern, without a regional pattern, and how many districts are going to referendum, there's something off here. And, you know, you could probably, as was alluded to, you can trace this back to 1993-94, really, where you saw right before that, there were very few operating referendums, even debt referendums, I think, from that one big visual that Brian showed. 1993-94 hits, and the legislature decides to impose the revenue limits, but at least during that time, they were tied to inflation. So they were limited, but they were helping districts kind of keep up with just regular costs. So you saw some referendums during that time, but mostly debt referendums. And
Yeah.
like Brian said, great context. We had a three-legged stool where to some degree, state aids were kept in a 2/3 ratio with compared to overall spending. But then you hit 2009-10, which was the first year that the legislature took away that indexing to inflation. So all of a sudden, in the middle of the Great Recession, which was a reason why the legislature decoupled inflation from funding schools, because it was trying to meet its own budget obligations, you see this divergence between what school districts are getting to run the district, just baseline operating revenues, and how they're being funded through the revenue limit. And so over time, and that indexing, I think, Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the idea was it was going to be put back into place. It was supposed to be temporary, right? And maybe not. I suppose it doesn't matter because
The irony
it's
is
been,
that
it never was.
revenue limits themselves were supposed to be temporary.
Oh,
Let
okay,
alone the
okay.
indexing, right?
Yeah.
It was supposed to be a 5-year quick fix, and then it's just the nature of legislative bodies that they kind of, once that system was put in place, it's very hard to change.
Yeah. So yeah, so you see over time, as probably everyone on this call has seen the chart that we always show that shows sort of this accumulative divergence between what school districts would have needed to keep up with inflation and what they got. And that over time, as of the end of this biennium, school districts will be on average across the state over $3,300 per pupil. They would be receiving $3,300 per pupil less than what they would have gotten over time to keep up with inflation. So in a sense, referendums have become this de facto essential component to the way we fund schools in the state. It's just part of the system now. It's not a measurement of a district not managing its resources well. It's not, you know, necessarily about mismanagement. I mean, it's really, when you look across the state and you look at how referendum use has grown over time, how it's grown as a percent of districts' operating revenues, how much they depend on it. This is a systemic problem. And if you think about it, it really is tied to revenue limits in general, because not only are they falling behind and need to go to referendum just to make ends meet, but there's such differences between what districts are getting on a per pupil basis. So you've got districts, because they're locked into what they were spending in 1993, 94, just have built-in sort of disparities. And adding to those disparities is some districts go to referendum and win, some districts don't. Some districts never go to referendum because they know their community won't support it. So we don't even like have data on that sort of counterfactual. Like there's sort of fiscal distress out there that isn't getting written about in an article about a failed referendum because those districts never went to referendum. Some of them never went because they're managing to do things, they're managing to balance their budgets without one, but only temporarily. I mean, a lot of districts who are doing really well are in a never-ending cycle, like Mike talked about. And so those are all things to think about. The disparate impacts across the state is something to take note of as well. Like I said, some always tend to pass, some often fail. And then you've got referendums like this in April. You can see some of the communications challenges. So take for example, Herman Neosho Rubicon. They lost their referendum that was trying to consolidate schools. They were trying to save money over time by consolidating schools, and that was the purpose of the referendum, and they lost. They're trying to do the right thing. Shawano lost a referendum that wasn't raising taxes. So there's like this communications issue. There's disparate understanding on the part of communities about what these referendums are for. And it's not necessarily related to like what kind of district or region. Like Brian was saying, it's sort of across the board, whether it's rural, urban, or suburban. It's all over the regions. It's all different kinds of referendums. And so there's that inflationary and systemic way that we underfund schools that's driving a lot of this. Mike also talked about a really key part of this is declining enrollment. That was not such an issue in the heyday of referendums and when we didn't have to go to referendum as much. But now we have declining enrollment in many, many districts across the state, over 3/4. And as we all know, the districts don't shrink well. If you're in declining enrollment, your costs are not shrinking anywhere near the rate your revenues are shrinking. And so that's a huge driver of people going to referendums. And then the last big component driving all this are fiscal cliffs. So we talk about especially right now, the drop off, the expiration of the federal pandemic aid, and the fact that a lot of districts really did do their best to try to only spend that money on non-recurring expenses. But a lot of the need that districts have, a lot of the academic and social emotional recovery kids need, they still need. And there's staffing in place that's really helping those kids. And districts are looking for ways to keep those staffing and programs on the books, but their federal money is going away, and they need to make cuts elsewhere to keep that going. And then the other sort of family of fiscal cliff is the non-recurring referendums that districts are going to. Once you go to non-recurring referendum, just to keep the lights on, just to keep things moving on a baseline, you're now dependent on that. And so you've got your own built-in mini fiscal cliff every time your non-recurring referendum starts to expire. So those are some of the how we got here questions.
I think if I were a candidate as a business manager or as a superintendent, my first two questions in the interview, at the end of the interview, when they turn and say, do you have any questions for us? Question one would be, do you have an expiring non-recurring revenue? Referendum to exceed. And then the second question would be, show me your enrollment projection. Because it's your demographics are your destiny under this model. At the highest level, what I find frustrating is as Brian referred to several times, I do feel like the last leaf on the tree. I've been doing this a long, long time now. The reason we have revenue limits in the first place is from the early 90s, and the argument was the school districts could not control their tax levies. And there was truth in that. The tax levies were up in the 7, 8, and 9% statewide. But then that asks the next, or leads to the next question: why couldn't school districts control their tax levies? And it's because in that era, the collective bargaining laws were very different. Collective bargaining laws were really, and I say this as a friend of labor, they were really tilted towards the labor unions. And they probably needed to be back in that era, but they were. Well, so that's why so I guess my point is that the underlying reason why we have revenue limits went away in 2011-13. School districts can easily control their labor costs now in a way they never could before, and yet we still have the revenue limits. And so it's such a frustrating patchwork of policies. Yeah, I worry about where it's heading. I don't think the taxpayers can sustain this level of referenda questions, not just from the school districts, but from the municipalities as well.
Yeah.
And then what's the next step beyond that? Yeah.
And there's equity issues here. Like,
Oh gosh, yeah.
one of the things that many of you might be aware of, the forward analytics piece that came out that really gave us a good historical view of what's been going on with referendums. Brian referred to these 100 districts that are dependent on referendums for more than 10% of their budgets. Like, over 3/4 of those are districts with fewer than 1,000 students. So, this is although referendums are kind of across, districts across the board, across locale types, whether it's suburban, urban, or rural, everybody is going to referendum, but but the impacts are a little bit steeper for small districts and districts that are in declining enrollment. They are in, as you can imagine, logically, but the greater, in fact, I think the quote was, if your district is losing more than 10% of your students, you're more than twice as likely to go to referendum. So this is not a system. This is not a logical system for funding schools. This is, it's hard to understand how this, you can understand why there would be communication challenges with your community. You can see why your community might say, why are you coming to me for more money? You get state aid, you get property taxes. Why are you asking me for more? What's the problem here? And that would be an uphill battle for communicating that. But you do kind of wonder how policymakers don't understand kind of how all of this comes together and the need for a different system or a systemic approach. And the other thing that's going on, it's interesting to watch, is the interplay between capital and operating. The last two, I believe, referendum cycles, the capital passage rate was a little higher than operating. And that's interesting. And you are seeing districts go, I need both, but which one should I ask for? And another question I always have is, to what degree are some of these capital referendums a result of the fact that you couldn't keep up with regular operating routine maintenance, and you're at the point now where you have to go to major capital projects, whereas that, I think the idea people have is that you're building a new facility, but a lot of these capital referendums are for maintenance and they're losing. So, or some of them are, so.
Well, let's sort of transition here towards a little bit of a wrap up. Maybe some thoughts about November, or thoughts about the system generally. I think I'll get us started. I think for me, I want to go back to Brian's statements earlier. The good news here is that communities, more than not, do seem to understand. At least many of them do. 60% or higher passage rate is, I think, like a really positive democratic thing. I mean, small d democratic, right? These communities understand what's at stake with their local school districts. So I'm encouraged by that. And for those of you who'll be going to referendum in November, as you saw here, you basically have this window between today and late August to get your plan and your resolutions together and have the board pass them. So there is still time. And then one final comment from me, and this is really for the business officials, is we see increasing scrutiny around how the financial impact of the referendum is expressed in terms of impact on individual homeowners. The average impact, or sometimes tying it to equalized tax rate projections, can be pretty tricky. So you don't ever want to be in a position where you could be accused of misleading on one of these things. So take the extra time. Work with your financial advisor, work with your attorneys, maybe work with your board or a citizen committee, and make sure that you're vetting all the information that you're putting out there, especially the financial information, just to make sure it passes the fairness test, right? No one can actually predict exactly what the individual impact is on every home or any home long term with these things, but you can at least attempt to be fair, and I want to emphasize that. So I'll go to Anne, and then Brian, and then Brian Adesso to wrap this up. Any other comments, Anne?
I don't think so. I think I got my say.
Well, I'm really glad you brought up the equity issue. I worry about these districts that should but can't pass these referenda. Brian Brewer, thank you for the slide deck. Any other comments you'd like to share with the WASBO audience?
No, I appreciate the time today. It is the work ahead of time as you organize your talking points to your message there about the tax impact, and there was some questions in the chat as well about, like, what is the impact you're talking about, right? And what is it not is probably the more important message, especially as it relates to reassessments versus growth and equalized value, which is what the school district sets its mill rate based on, and then apportions it to the municipalities, right? So
right,
we have some slides on that as well, but it's not an easy thing to communicate to everyone all at once. It just
right.
So that's why we encourage our clients to continue to talk about the district level, because you have any number of underlying municipalities that you're going to apportion that tax to, and describe. This is why we talk about it as a school district level mill rate based on our total fair market value, and then talk about how reassessment is really just reapportioning within a municipality. So that's a whole nother money talks that we could probably talk
That's
about.
right.
But again,
right.
it ties into what Mike was saying about clear message, concise message about the financial impact.
Yeah, Brian and I were both involved tangentially in a dispute in Monroe School District that went to its court, where some taxpayers after the fact attempted to overturn the results of the referendum, saying that it passed based on misrepresentation of financial impact. It didn't succeed, and it didn't even seem like it was really close. The judge's decision was really firm, but it did seem to me like a little warning bell, like we better be careful. And then we'll wrap it up with our friend Brian Adesso. Hey, Brian.
Good. So I just have more wonderings, and some questions we're going to answer. But as you know, November will probably be a record-breaking year for referendums, and I would also say my crystal ball is going to say that November in 2 years will even be bigger. And at what point do we get noticed, and what's that going to look like at that time? Of course, I don't have any answers, but as I'm in my profession, I think about that, and strategically you got to start to think about it, and when's the best time to go.
Right. Not easy to be a school board member these days, that's for sure.
Yep.
So I want to thank everybody for joining us. Just a reminder, WASBO Spring Conference at the Kalahari, May 15, 16, 17, right in there. Hope we can see you there. Also, again, the slide deck from this presentation will be on the WASBO website within an hour or so. And then one
And the
final
recording.
and the recording. Thank you, Ryan. So one final thank you to all of our panelists, and everybody have a great Friday and a great weekend. We'll see you next month.